In the autumn of 1887, when the Colorado Territory still held more secrets than settlements, there lived a man who had traded his reputation as the deadliest gun west of Denver for something far more dangerous, the hope of becoming someone worth loving. This is the story of how a smile proved mightier than steel, and how two wounded souls found salvation not in violence, but in the quiet courage it takes to lay down your weapons and trust another human being. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Bitter Creek's only saloon as Josiah Deadeye Thorne swept the last of the broken glass from the night before into a dustpan. His massive frame moved with surprising gentleness around the scattered chairs and overturned tables, each piece of furniture treated like something precious rather than the battered wood it was. At 34, Josiah stood 6 feet 7 inches. In his worn boots, with shoulders that had once filled doorways with menace, and hands that had ended more lives than he cared to count. Now those same hands carefully righted a wobbling table leg and smoothed the tablecloth that had seen better. Decades, the Silver Dollar Saloon sat at the edge of Bitter Creek like a tired old dog, too stubborn to die but too worn to bark with any real threat. Josiah had bought the place 6 months ago with money earned from his last job money that still felt heavy in his conscience. The previous owner, a consumptive gambler named Murphy, had been eager to sell to anyone willing to pay in cash and ask no questions. Josiah had been both willing and able, and now he found himself the unlikely proprietor of the territory's most peaceable drinking establishment. He moved behind the bar, his spurs silent on the floorboards. Those spurs had once announced his arrival like a death knell in towns from here to the Mexican border. Now he'd filed down the rowels until they barely whispered, another small rebellion against the man he'd been. The morning light streaming through the dusty windows caught the pearl handle of the Colt .45 at his hip, the same gun that had earned him his reputation and his nickname. He'd thought about getting rid of it more times than he could count, but somehow it remained, a constant reminder of who he was trying not to be. The saloon's interior told the story of a man attempting to create something civilized from chaos. Where other establishments of its kind featured nude paintings and crude humor, Josiah had hung landscapes amateur watercolors he'd bought from a traveling artist who'd needed meal money more than artwork. The bar itself gleamed with the kind of attention usually reserved for fine furniture, not saloon fixtures. He'd spent countless evenings rubbing linseed oil into the scarred wood until it responded with a warm glow that made the whole room feel less like a place for drowning sorrows and more like a place for quiet conversation. Behind the bar, bottles were arranged with military precision, labels facing out, heights graduated like soldiers in formation. This wasn't the haphazard collection of rot-gut whiskey typical of frontier drinking establishments. Josiah had written to suppliers in Denver and Kansas City, researching quality spirits the way other men studied cattle breeding or mining claims. He'd even added a small selection of tea and coffee, though few of his patrons ever requested either. The regulars knew better than to start trouble in Deadeye Thorne's place, though not for the reasons one might expect. It wasn't fear that kept them civilized, it was something harder to define. Maybe it was the way Josiah served drinks with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, or the way he'd listened to their troubles without judgment or interruption. Maybe it was the way he'd quietly settle their tabs when times were hard, or how he'd make sure the town drunk made it home safe instead of freezing in an alley. More likely, it was the growing realization among Bitter Creek's residents that Deadeye Thorne was trying to kill his reputation with kindness, and most folks found themselves reluctant to interfere with a man's attempt at redemption. The morning ritual continued as Josiah checked his inventory, counting bottles with the same methodical precision he'd once used to count bullets. Whiskey, brandy, gin, each bottle represented a choice to build rather than destroy. He'd learned to make simple meals in the small kitchen behind the bar, nothing fancy but clean and filling. Beef stew, cornbread, sometimes eggs when the chickens he kept out back were cooperative. The idea of serving food had come to him gradually. Men drank differently when they had something solid in their stomachs. And Josiah preferred customers who could hold conversations over those who could barely hold their heads up. The town of Bitter Creek itself sat in a valley between two ridges of scrub pine and granite, founded by optimistic prospectors who'd found just enough gold to keep hope alive, but never enough to get rich. The main street stretched for 3 blocks before giving way to scattered homesteads and the inevitable cemetery that marked the edge of every frontier settlement. The population hovered around 200 souls, counting the children, and everyone knew everyone else's business with the intimate detail that came from shared isolation. Most of the townspeople had heard stories about Deadeye Thorne long before he'd arrived. Stories that grew in the telling, as such stories do. They said he'd killed 15 men in fair fights and twice that number who hadn't been looking for trouble. They said he could draw and fire before a man could blink, that he'd once shot them buttons off a man's vest from 50 paces just to make a point. They said he'd ridden with the Dalton gang, that he'd been a Texas Ranger, that he'd hunted down train robbers for the Pinkertons. Some of these stories were true, most were not. All of them followed Josiah like shadows he couldn't shake, no matter how many acts of quiet kindness he performed, or how many months passed without violence. The truth was simpler and more complicated than the legends. Josiah Thorne had been born in Kansas to farmers who'd worked themselves to death, trying to coax crops from unforgiving soil. Orphaned at 16, he'd drifted west with the skills most young men acquired on the frontier. He could ride, rope, shoot, and survive on very little. The shooting had come naturally, the way music came to some people or mathematics to others. His hand was steady, his eye was true, and his reflexes were lightning quick. What had made him deadly wasn't just skill with a gun, it was the cold emptiness that had settled in his chest after watching his parents die of exhaustion and disappointment. For nearly 15 years, he'd carried that emptiness like armor, letting it protect him from feeling too much about the men he'd killed or the reputation he'd built. He'd worked as a hired gun for cattlemen, mining companies, and anyone else, with enough money to pay for his particular skills. He'd told himself he was just making a living, that someone else would do the job if he didn't, that the world was a hard place and he was just hard enough to survive it. The change had come. Gradually, like winter turning to spring, so slow you didn't notice until one day you realized everything was different. Maybe it had started with the kid in Abilene, barely 18 and too scared to run when Josiah had been hired to stop him from rustling cattle. The boy had stood there shaking, trying to draw on a man he knew could kill him before he cleared. Leather, and something in Josiah's chest had cracked like ice in a thaw. He'd let the kid live, told the rancher the rustler had skipped town, and ridden away from that job with his fee only half earned and a weight in his stomach that whiskey couldn't touch. After that, the kills had started to matter. Faces began staying with him after the gun smoke cleared. Names started haunting his sleep. The morning of his last gunfight, Josiah had looked in the mirror of a hotel in Dodge City and seen a stranger wearing his face. Gray streaked his dark hair, lines mapped the corners of his eyes, and something vital had gone out of his gaze. He'd realized with the clarity of a man standing on a cliff's edge that he could either change or disappear entirely. And disappearing was starting to look like the easier option. Instead, he'd holster his gun, bought a train ticket, and ridden west until he found a place where nobody knew Deadeye Thorne except by reputation. Bitter Creek had been far enough from his old haunts and desperate enough for a business owner to overlook a questionable past. Now he stood behind his bar, polishing glasses that were already clean, and tried to convince himself that 6 months of peaceful living could somehow balance 15 years of violence. The arithmetic didn't work, but he kept trying anyway. One quiet day at a time. The Silver Dollar opened its doors at 10 each morning, though most days the first customer didn't arrive until well past noon. Josiah used the quiet hours for maintenance and reflection, checking the building for loose boards or leaky pipes, reading whatever books he could acquire through the mail, and writing letters to suppliers about inventory. He'd taught himself to read account books and had discovered an unexpected aptitude for numbers. The saloon was profitable in a modest way, enough to pay his expenses and set aside money for improvements. Today felt different from the moment he stepped outside to sweep the porch. The air carried a tension that had nothing to do with weather, and the usual sounds of the town seemed muffled and distant. Even the dogs that normally barked at anything that moved were quiet, as if they sensed something approaching that required their full attention. Josiah had learned to trust such feelings. A man didn't survive 15 years as a gunfighter without developing an instinct for trouble, and that instinct was rarely wrong. He finished his sweeping and went back inside, unconsciously checking the position of his gun and scanning the street through the window. The tension stretched through the morning hours like a wire being pulled taut. Josiah went through his usual routines, checking inventory, wiping down tables, arranging bottles, but part of his attention remained focused on the street outside and the feeling that something was coming to Bitter Creek, something that would test the new life he'd been building. By noon, when the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning's thin layer of clouds, Josiah understood what his instincts had been trying to tell him. 3 riders approached from the east, their horses moving at the unhurried pace of men who had traveled far and were confident of their welcome. Even at a distance, Josiah recognized the lead rider's silhouette, tall, lean, sitting his horse with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to being feared. Frank Morrison, known throughout the territory as Black Frank for his habit of wearing dark clothes and darker moods, had been Josiah's partner in more jobs than either man cared to remember. If Frank had found him in Bitter Creek, it could only mean one thing: someone was willing to pay enough money to bring Deadeye Thorne out of retirement. Josiah felt the familiar weight of his gun at his hip, felt his hand twitch toward the grip, with muscle memory that years of peaceful living hadn't entirely erased. For a moment, the old coldness tried to settle back into his chest, the emotional armor that had kept him alive through so many violent years. Then he looked around his saloon, at the clean tables, the carefully arranged bottles, the watercolor landscapes that nobody else would have thought to hang in such a place, and made a choice. He wasn't Deadeye Thorne anymore, hadn't been for 6 months, and he wouldn't become that man again just because his past had finally tracked him down. 3 riders pulled up outside the Silver Dollar just as the town clock struck 12:30. Josiah could hear them talking in low voices, though he couldn't make out words through the closed door. He knew Frank's voice, knew the other 2 would be gunmen of similar reputation and similar morals. Men who solved problems with bullets and considered conversation a waste of time. The door swung open with a creak that seemed louder than usual, and Frank Morrison stepped into the Silver Dollar like he owned the place. He was exactly as Josiah remembered, whip-thin, with cold eyes and a smile that promised unpleasant things. His 2 companions followed, spreading out slightly in the automatic positioning of men who expected trouble and were prepared to handle it efficiently. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Deadeye Thorne, playing bartender. Always knew you had a sense of humor, Josiah, but this might be the funniest joke I've ever seen." Josiah continued polishing the glass in his hands, not looking up from his work. "Frank, boys, what brings you to Bitter Creek?" "You know damn well what brings us, partner. The Cattlemen's Association down in New Mexico has a problem that needs solving. Seems some farmers have gotten ideas about water rights that don't sit well with folks who run cattle. They're offering $5,000 to make the problem go away permanent like. $5,000. More money than Josiah had seen in one place since he'd bought the saloon. Enough money to expand the business, maybe buy some of the land. Around town, set himself up comfortable for the rest of his life. All he had to do was ride south, kill a few farmers who probably had wives and children, and collect his fee. I'm not in that business anymore, Frank. Frank's laugh was like broken glass. Course you are, partner. Man doesn't just stop being what he is because he trades his horse for an apron. You're Dead-Eye Thorn. Killing's what you do, just like breathing. Maybe once, not anymore. See, that's where you're wrong. Frank stepped closer to the bar, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Because I already told the association you'd take the job. Gave them my word you'd be in Socorro by the end of the month. Now you wouldn't want to make me a liar, would you, Josiah? The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Frank Morrison wasn't a man who accepted refusal gracefully, and he had 2 armed men backing his play. The old Josiah would have already moved, would have cleared leather and put 3 men on the floor before they knew the conversation was over. The new Josiah set down his glass very carefully and met Frank's eyes without flinching. I'm sorry. You made a promise you can't keep, Frank, but I'm not riding anywhere. This is my home now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frank's expression shifted from false friendliness to genuine menace. Your home? This shithole town in the middle of nowhere? Come on, Josiah. You're fooling yourself if you think you can just pretend to be someone else. We both know what you are underneath all this. He gestured dismissively at the clean saloon. ... domestic bullshit. What I am, Josiah said quietly, is a man trying to build something instead of tearing it down. You should try it sometime, Frank. Might surprise you how much better you sleep at night. The 2 gunmen flanking Frank shifted slightly, reading the tension in the room and preparing for violence. Josiah could feel the familiar calculations running through his mind: angles of fire, cover, the exact distance to each man's gun hand. His body wanted to move, wanted to end this threat before it could develop further, but he forced himself to remain still. Last chance, partner, Frank said. Pack your gear, saddle your horse, and ride out with us. Otherwise, I might have to convince you that retirement doesn't suit a man of your talents. And I might have to show you that some things are worth more than money. Josiah replied. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the tick of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer from somewhere down the street. 3 killers faced 1 reformed gunfighter across a bar that smelled of lemon oil and honest work. And for a moment, the fate of Bitter Creek's most unlikely business owner hung in the balance. Then the door opened again, and everything changed. Woman who walked through the silver dollars swinging doors carried herself like someone accustomed to walking into rooms full of dangerous men. She was neither tall nor short, neither stunning nor plain, but there was something about the way she moved that made all 4 armed men turn to look at her. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a practical style that had given up on fashion in favor of staying out of her way, and her dress was the deep blue of a mountain lake, simple but well made. What caught Josiah's attention wasn't her appearance, it was the complete absence of fear in her green eyes as she took in the scene before her. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of a schoolteacher addressing unruly students. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Frank Morrison turned toward her with the predatory smile he reserved for easy prey. Well now, miss, I think you might want to find somewhere else to, Dr. Catherine Whitmore. She interrupted, extending her hand to Frank as if she expected him to shake it like a gentleman instead of a killer. I'm the new physician in town, and you are? The casual way she dropped her title into the conversation was like watching someone lay a royal flush on a poker table. Frank's expression shifted from predatory confidence to confused caution. Doctors, even female ones, commanded a certain respect on the frontier, where medical knowledge often meant the difference between life and death. "Frank Morrison," he replied after a moment's hesitation, automatically reaching out to shake her offered hand. "I was just conducting some business. With Mr. Thorne here." "How wonderful," Catherine said, releasing his hand and moving toward the bar with the brisk efficiency of someone who had places to be and things to accomplish. "Mr. Thorne, I've been meaning to speak with you about establishing a small clinic. Space. I understand you have rooms above the saloon that aren't currently in use." Josiah found himself staring at this woman who had walked into a gunfight and somehow turned it into a real estate negotiation. Yes, ma'am. There are a couple of rooms upstairs." "Excellent. Perhaps we could discuss terms?" "I'm afraid I've just arrived on the morning stage, and I'm quite eager to begin setting up my practice." She settled herself on one of the bar stools as if she planned to stay a while, completely ignoring the 3 armed men who were staring at her with varying degrees of bewilderment. Frank cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation here. This is a private conversation between old friends." Catherine turned to look at him with the patient expression of someone explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. "Mr. Morrison, I've been traveling for 3 days on stages that apparently use tree stumps for seats. I haven't had a decent meal since Denver, and I have a practice to establish in a town that clearly needs medical attention. Your private conversation will simply have to wait until I've concluded my business with Mr. Thorne." She turned back to Josiah with a smile that was somehow both professional and warm. "Now then, about those rooms. I'll need space for examinations, a small surgical area, and storage for supplies. I can pay 3 months' rent in advance." The silence that followed was unlike any Josiah had experienced in 15 years of dangerous living. He'd been in standoffs, where men's lives hung on the twitch of a finger, where the wrong word could start a war, where the very air seemed to crackle with potential violence. But he'd never been in a situation where a woman had simply decided that her concerns were more important than anyone else's guns. "Ma'am," one of Frank's men finally said, his voice carefully respectful. "Perhaps you didn't notice, but we're all armed here." Catherine glanced at the speaker with mild interest. "Yes, I noticed. I also noticed that Mr. Thorne keeps a very clean establishment, which suggests he's a man who takes pride in his work. That's exactly the sort of person I prefer to do business with." She looked back at Josiah. "The rooms, Mr. Thorne?" Josiah felt something shift inside his chest, like a locked door that had suddenly remembered how to open. This woman, this doctor, had walked into his saloon during what might have been his last moments as a peaceful man, and somehow her presence had changed everything. Not because she was beautiful, though she was attractive in her own way. Not because she was charming, though there was something compelling about her absolute confidence. But because she looked at him and saw a businessman, a potential landlord, a man worth doing business with. Not Deadeye Thorne the killer, not a gunfighter trying to escape his past, but simply Josiah Thorne, proprietor of the Silver Dollar Saloon. "The rooms are yours, Dr. Whitmore," he said. "We can discuss terms after these gentlemen conclude their business and move along." Frank's face darkened. "Now hold on, Josiah. We're not finished." "Actually," Catherine interjected pleasantly, "I believe you are. You see, gentlemen, I took the liberty of speaking with Sheriff Henderson before coming here. Lovely man, very concerned about the welfare of his community. He mentioned that he'd be keeping a close eye on any out-of-town visitors, particularly those who might be looking to cause trouble for local business owners who are contributing to the town's prosperity." She pulled a folded paper from her reticule and placed it on the bar. "In fact, he asked me to deliver this to Mr. Thorne. Something about a business license renewal, I believe." Josiah unfolded the paper and found a hastily scrawled note. "Doc says these 3 are trouble. Town council meeting tonight at 7. Be there. Henderson, Frank's eyes narrowed as he tried to read the note upside down. What's that say? Official. Business, Catherine said before Josiah could respond. The kind that requires Mr. Thorne's immediate attention, I'm afraid. Perhaps you gentlemen should come back another time when he's not so busy with civic duties. The beauty of her intervention was that she hadn't actually lied about anything. There probably was a town council meeting. Henderson likely was concerned about strangers, and the note was certainly official in its own way. But she'd presented these facts in a way that made Frank and his men feel like they were walking into a trap rather than springing one. Frank looked around the room, clearly calculating odds that had suddenly shifted in ways he didn't like. Doctor who was friendly with the sheriff, a town council that was apparently protective of local businesses, and a target who seemed to have more support than anticipated. These weren't the conditions under which smart gunfighters operated. This isn't over, Josiah, Frank said finally. Job's still there when you come to your senses. I appreciate the offer, Frank, but I won't be needing it. Frank turned to leave, then paused. You sure about this, partner? Last chance to ride out easy. I'm sure. Frank nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to be both acknowledgement and threat. He jerked his head toward the door, and his two companions followed him out of the saloon. The sound of their horses' hooves faded gradually as they rode. Toward the edge of town. Catherine waited until the sound had completely disappeared before turning back to Josiah. Well, that was invigorating. Now about those rooms? Josiah found himself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. Ma'am, I think you just saved my life. Nonsense. I simply conducted a bit of business at a convenient time. Though I do hope you meant what you said about the rooms. I really am a doctor, and this town really does need medical attention. She reached into her reticule again and produced a leather folder containing official-looking documents. Catherine Whitmore graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, previously practiced in Chicago until I decided the frontier needed my services more than the city did. Josiah examined the credentials, though he wouldn't have known how to spot a forgery if his life depended on it. What impressed him was that she'd produced them at all. Most people on the frontier took you at your word about who you were, mainly because there was no way to verify anything anyway. Why Bitter Creek? He asked. Town this size can't offer much in the way of opportunities. Catherine's smile changed, becoming less professional and more personal. You'd be surprised how much opportunity there is in a place where you can make a real difference. Chicago has plenty of doctors. Out here, I might be the only medical training within 100 miles. Every life I save, every bone I set, every baby I deliver, it all matters in a way it never could in the city. She looked around the saloon with the same assessing gaze she'd used on the armed men. Besides, I like what you've done with this place. Most establishments of this type are, well, let's say they cater to men's baser instincts. But this feels like a place where people might actually enjoy each other's company. That was the idea, Josiah admitted. Though I'll confess, entertaining guests wasn't exactly in my previous line of work. And what was your previous line of work, Mr. Thorne? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired gun. Josiah could lie, could claim to have been a cowhand or a prospector, or any of a dozen other professions that would explain his presence in Bitter Creek without raising uncomfortable questions. But something about Catherine Whitmore made him want to tell the truth, or at least as much of it as he could bear to speak aloud. I was in the security business, protecting people and property. It was profitable work, but not the kind that lets a man sleep well at night. Catherine nodded as if he'd given her a perfectly ordinary answer. I imagine not. Security work in this territory would involve a great deal of unpleasantness. I'm glad you found something more suited to your temperament. The way she said it suggested she understood exactly what kind of security work he meant, but chose to treat it as just another career change. like a farmer who'd decided to try storekeeping, or a teacher who'd taken up law. The rooms, Josiah sighed, eager to change the subject. They're not much to look at right now, but they're structurally sound. Previous owner used them for storage mostly. Perfect. Storage space is exactly what I need, along with good light and access to running water. Well, we've got a pump in the kitchen downstairs, and the windows face east, so you'll get good morning light. Catherine stood up from the bar stool with the decisive movement of someone who'd made up her mind. Excellent. Shall we have a look? Josiah led her up the narrow stairs behind the bar, acutely aware of her presence behind him. The rooms were dusty and filled with odds and ends broken chairs, empty bottles, a collection of dime novels that someone had abandoned. But the bones were good, solid floors, large windows, walls that could support shelving for medical supplies. This will do nicely, Catherine said, walking to the window and looking out at the street below. I can set up examination tables here, use the smaller room for storage and private consultations. With some cleaning and the right equipment, this could be quite functional. About the rent, Josiah began. 3 months in advance, as I mentioned. $50. It was more money than Josiah typically saw in a month, enough to make several improvements to the saloon and maybe even hire some help. But more than that, it represented something he'd been trying to build since arriving in Bitter Creek: legitimacy. A doctor practicing above his saloon would give the silver dollar a respectability that no amount of cleaning or careful management could achieve. That's fair, he said. When would you like to start moving in? Immediately if possible. My supplies should arrive on tomorrow's freight wagon, and I'd like to be ready to receive patients by the end of the week. She turned from the window to face him, and for the first time since she'd walked into his saloon, Catherine Whitmore looked uncertain. Mr. Thorne, I hope you don't mind my asking, but those men who were here earlier, should I be concerned about them returning? It was a reasonable question, and one that deserved an honest answer. I don't think they'll be back soon. Frank Morrison is many things, but he's not stupid. He won't try anything while you're here, not with the sheriff watching and the town council involved. But they will be back eventually? Josiah considered lying, but found he couldn't. Probably. Men like Frank don't give up easy when there's money involved. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. Then we'll simply have to make sure that when they do return, you're too valuable to this community for anyone to consider letting them take you away. The casual way she said, we sent an unexpected warmth through Josiah's chest. When was the last time anyone had spoken as if his problems were their problems too? Dr. Whitmore, Catherine, please. If we're going to be business partners, we should dispense with excessive formality. Catherine, you don't know anything about me, about my past, about why men like Frank Morrison might want to drag me away from here. It might be safer for you to find other arrangements. She studied his face with the same careful attention she'd probably give to a patient's symptoms. Mr. Thorne, Josiah, I've spent the last 5 years treating gunshot wounds, knife cuts, and the various injuries that men inflict on each other when they decide violence is the solution to their problems. I've seen what killers look like when they bring their victims to my door, begging me to save lives they just finished trying to end. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. You're not a killer anymore, Josiah. Whatever you were before, whatever you did, that man isn't standing in this room with me right now. How can you be so sure? Catherine's smile was gentle but certain. Because a killer wouldn't have spent 6 months turning a frontier saloon into a place where people feel safe. A killer wouldn't polish glasses that are already clean, or hang landscape paintings where most men would hang crude pictures. A killer wouldn't have let those 3 men walk out of here alive when they threatened everything he's built. She was right, and they both knew it. The old Josiah would have ended the confrontation, the moment Frank drew a breath to make his threats. 3 men would have died, and Deadeye Thorne would have ridden out of Bitter Creek before their bodies. Cooled, leaving behind nothing but another bloody legend and a reputation that grew with each retelling. Maybe, Josiah said quietly. But that doesn't mean the past won't catch up with me eventually. Then we'll deal with it when it does. Together, there was that word again. We. Catherine Whitmore had known him for less than an hour, had walked into his life during a crisis, and somehow decided that his problems were worth sharing. It made no logical sense, and yet something in her certainty made Josiah want to believe that maybe, just maybe, a man could change completely enough to deserve a fresh start. The rent, he said. $50 is too much, 25. 50, Catherine repeated firmly. This is a business arrangement, Josiah, not charity. I'm getting valuable space in a prime location, and you deserve fair compensation. Catherine, besides. She continued with a grin that transformed her serious face into something unexpectedly playful. I plan to be a very demanding tenant. I'll expect hot water available at all hours, quiet during examinations, and help moving heavy equipment. $50 is probably a bargain. Despite everything, the confrontation with Frank, the uncertainty about the future, the weight of a past that refused to stay buried, Josiah found himself grinning back. You drive a hard bargain, Dr. Whitmore. I certainly do. Now, shall we go downstairs and formalize our arrangement? I have a medical practice to establish, and you have a saloon to run. As they descended the narrow stairs, Josiah caught himself thinking about the way Catherine had handled Frank Morrison and his men. Not through intimidation or violence, but through intelligence, confidence, and an absolute refusal to be cowed by dangerous men. She'd turned what could have been a bloodbath into a business meeting, and she'd done it with nothing more than quick thinking and unshakable composure. Back in the main room of the saloon, Catherine pulled a small leather notebook from her reticule and began writing. I'll need a receipt for the rent, of course. And perhaps we could establish some ground rules for shared use of the building, such as medical emergencies take precedence over social drinking. If someone arrives bleeding, I'll need immediate access to hot water and clean linens, regardless of what's happening down here. Of course. And I'd prefer not to treat patients while there's excessive noise or unseemly behavior happening below. Josiah nodded. The Silver Dollar isn't that kind of establishment. I suspected as much. Still, it's better to be clear about expectations. She tore a page from her notebook and handed it to him. My rent payment, as promised. Josiah looked at the check drawn on a Chicago bank, made out for $50, signed in the same neat handwriting as the rental agreement. Real money from a real bank, offered by a real doctor who apparently saw potential in both his building and his character. Catherine, he said as she prepared to leave, thank you for what you did with Frank, for everything. She paused at the door, one hand on the frame. Josiah, I didn't help you because I'm particularly noble or brave. I helped you because this town needs what you're building here, and it needs what I'm planning to build upstairs. Sometimes the best way to help yourself is to help others succeed. She stepped outside, then turned back with that same playful grin. Besides, I have the feeling that having a reformed gunfighter as a landlord might be very good for business. Not many people would be foolish enough to skip out on a medical bill when Deadeye Thorne is the one collecting rent. She was gone before Josiah could respond, leaving him standing in his doorway with a check in one hand, and the growing realization that his carefully constructed quiet life was about to become considerably more complicated. But as he watched Catherine Whitmore walk down the dusty street with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever she decided to go, Josiah found himself looking forward to the complications. For the first time since arriving in Bitter Creek, he felt like he might actually deserve the new life he'd been trying to build. The freight wagon arrived 3 days later, creaking under the weight of wooden crates, marked with medical supply company stamps from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. Catherine had spent the intervening days measuring spaces, sketching layouts, and consulting with Josiah about practical matters like ventilation and lighting. Their conversations had developed an easy rhythm that surprised them both professional. Discussions that somehow felt more personal than most people's intimate conversations. Josiah found himself looking forward to these consultations more than he cared to admit. Catherine had a way of asking questions that made him think about his saloon differently. Where he saw a simple business, she saw potential for community gathering. Where he focused on keeping trouble out, she envisioned bringing healing in. Her perspective was changing how he understood his own work, and he wasn't entirely sure how. He felt about that transformation. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Murphy, who'd been hauling freight across the territory for 20 years, eyed the medical equipment with obvious skepticism. "Don't know why anyone would want to practice doctoring this far from civilization," he muttered as he and Josiah began unloading the first crate. "Seems like a good way to get yourself killed. Dr. Whitmore strikes me as someone who can take care of herself," Josiah replied, hefting a box marked "Surgical Instruments, handle with care." "Maybe so, but what about when some drunk cowpoke decides he don't want to pay for getting his bullet wound sewn up? Or when the family of some fellow she couldn't save comes looking for revenge?" Doc and Laramie got run out of town last year for exactly that reason. Josiah paused in his lifting, considering the driver's words. He'd been so focused on his own past catching up with him that he hadn't given much thought to the dangers Catherine might face simply by virtue of her profession. Frontier medicine was a risky business in more ways than one, and a woman practicing alone was vulnerable in ways that even an experienced physician might not anticipate. Catherine emerged from the saloon carrying the clipboard and wearing a practical canvas apron over her dress. "Gentlemen, I hope you're being careful with that equipment. Some of those instruments came all the way from Germany, and they're irreplaceable out here." "Yes, ma'am," Murphy said, suddenly respectful. "We'll treat 'em like they was made of gold." She began checking items off her list as they unloaded each crate, occasionally opening boxes to examine the contents. Josiah caught glimpses of gleaming metal instruments whose purposes he could only guess at, bottles of chemicals with labels in multiple languages, and thick medical textbooks that looked like they contained more knowledge than most frontier towns saw in a year. "Dr. Whitmore," Murphy said as they moved the last crate into the saloon, "you mind me asking what made you decide to set up practice way out here? Most lady doctors I've heard of stick to the big cities where they got hospitals and such." Catherine straightened from examining a box of bandages, brushing dust from her apron. "That's exactly why I came here, Mr. Murphy, in Chicago. I was one of dozens of physicians competing for patients who had their choice of medical care. Out here, I might be the only trained doctor for 100 miles in any direction. Every skill I have, every technique I learned in medical school, matters more here than it ever could in the city." She gestured toward the street outside, where a woman was chasing 2 small children while balancing a baby on her hip. "That woman probably hasn't seen a doctor since she was married 5 years ago. The children have never been properly examined. If something goes wrong during her next pregnancy, the nearest medical help might be a 3-day ride away. Here, I can make a real difference." Murphy nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fine sentiment, Doc, but sentiment don't stop bullets or calm down angry drunks. You thought about what happens when you got troubles you can't handle with a scalpel and some fancy book learning?" Before Catherine could answer, Josiah found himself speaking up. "That's what I'm here for." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Catherine and Murphy. He hadn't planned to make any kind of declaration, hadn't consciously decided to position himself as Catherine's protector. But something about Murphy's question had touched a nerve that Josiah didn't know was exposed. Catherine looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Josiah, that's very generous, but I don't expect. You're renting space in my building, Josiah interrupted. That makes you my tenant, and I look after my tenants. Anyone who wants to cause trouble for Dr. Whitmore will have to go through me first. Murphy's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. That's quite a promise, mister. You sure you're ready to back it up? Unsure. There was something in Josiah's tone that made Murphy step back slightly, as if he'd suddenly remembered that men in this territory often carried more than one kind of credential. The freight driver finished securing his empty wagon and climbed onto the driver's seat with unusual haste. Well then, Murphy said, gathering his reins, I guess the dock's in good hands. Ma'am, you need anything else hauled out here, you just send word. Always happy to serve a paying customer. As the wagon rolled away, Josiah and Catherine stood in the dust of the street, surrounded by crates of medical supplies and the weight of unspoken promises. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle toward evening, casting long shadows that made everything looked different from how it had appeared that morning. That was quite a declaration, Catherine said finally. Just being practical. Bad for business if my tenants get harassed. Is that all it was? Business? Josiah met her eyes and found himself unable to give the easy, dismissive answer he'd intended. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe not. Catherine smiled, not the professional smile she used for business discussions, but something warmer and more personal. I appreciate the sentiment, Josiah, but I hope you understand that I didn't come here expecting to be protected by anyone. I came here to build something on my own. I understand. But that doesn't mean you have to build it alone. They began carrying the medical supplies upstairs, working together with the kind of coordinated efficiency that usually took people months to develop. Catherine would point to where she wanted each crate placed, and Josiah would position it. Exactly, often anticipating her needs before she voiced them. It was like watching two people who had been working together for years. Not dazed out, the rooms above the saloon were already transformed from dusty storage spaces into something that looked like it might actually become a medical practice. Catherine had scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, washed the windows until they sparkled, and arranged the existing furniture in ways that maximized both space and functionality. With the medical supplies added to the mix, the transformation was even more dramatic. This is going to work, Catherine said, surveying their progress. Better than I hoped, actually. What did you hope for? Honestly? I hoped for a roof that didn't leak, floors that would support medical equipment, and neighbors who wouldn't run me out of town for being an uppity woman with ideas above her station. Josiah stopped unpacking a crate of medicines to look at her. Has that happened before? Being run out of town? Not exactly run out, but let's say that some communities are more receptive to female physicians than others. There was a town in Kansas where the local pastor decided that women practicing medicine was against God's plan. Made things quite difficult until I found a more welcoming location. And you think Bitter Creek will be more welcoming? Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think Bitter Creek is a town where people are more concerned with results than with who provides them. If I can set bones and deliver babies and treat fevers, most folks won't care much about what I wear under my clothes or whether I'm supposed to be home tending a husband instead of tending patients. She began arranging surgical instruments on a clean white cloth, handling each tool with the familiarity of long practice. Besides, I have a secret weapon that most lady doctors don't have. What's that? A landlord with a reputation for handling trouble. The way she said it, half joking, but completely serious, made something shift in Josiah's chest. For 15 years, his reputation had been a burden, something that followed him like a shadow and colored every interaction he had with decent people. But Catherine spoke about it like it was a tool that could be used for good, an asset rather than a liability. Catherine, he said, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Yes? You should know what people say about me. About Deadeye Thorn. Most of it's true. She continued arranging instruments without looking up. I assumed as much. I've killed men. More than I like to count. Some of them probably didn't deserve it. I see. I've worked for people who cared more about profit than people. Done things that kept me awake at night for years. Catherine finally looked up from her work. Are you trying to scare me away? Josiah, I'm trying to be honest. You should know what kind of man you're doing business with. She set down the scalpel she'd been examining and faced him fully. What kind of man I'm doing business with is a man who spent 6 months turning a frontier saloon into a place where people feel safe. A man who polishes glasses that are already clean and hangs landscape paintings where most men would hang crude pictures. A man who just carried medical supplies upstairs for an hour without complaining and arranged everything exactly where I asked him to put it. But, Josiah, I don't care what Deadeye Thorne did. I care what Josiah Thorne does. And what Josiah Thorne does is run an honest business, treat people with respect, and apparently offer protection to lady doctors who probably don't deserve such kindness. The certainty in her voice was like a physical force, something that pushed back against 15 years of guilt and self-doubt. Josiah had spent so much time trying to atone for his past that he'd forgotten it was possible for someone to simply not care about it. You make it sound simple, he said. It is simple. You're not the same man you were 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or whenever you did whatever it is you're not proud of. People change, Josiah. The fact that you want to change is proof that you already have. She returned to her work, but there was something different in the atmosphere between them. A wall had come down, or maybe a door had opened. Either way, the space felt less formal, more personal. Can I ask you something? Josiah said. Of course. Why medicine? What made you want to become a doctor? Catherine smiled, but it was a sad smile, touched with old pain. My younger brother died when I was 16, scarlet fever. We lived in Boston then, had access to the best medical care available, but it wasn't enough. The doctor who treated him was kind but limited. He did everything he knew how to do, but what he knew wasn't enough. She picked up a small bottle of carbolic acid, holding it up to the light coming through the window. I decided that day that I was going to learn everything there was to know about healing, so that the next time someone's little brother was dying, maybe there would be options the doctor hadn't considered. And did you learn everything there was to know? I learned that no one knows everything, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. Every technique I master, every new treatment I discover, every life I save, it's like putting money in the bank against future tragedies. Josiah understood that philosophy better than she probably realized. It was exactly what he'd been trying to do with the silver dollar, build up enough good deeds to balance the scales against past sins. Maybe that's why Catherine's presence felt so right. They were both people trying to create something positive out of experiences that had marked them. Your brother, he said gently. What was his name? Tommy. He was 8 years old and wanted to be a sea captain when he grew up. Catherine's voice was steady, but Josiah could hear the echo of old grief in it. He died holding a toy ship I'd given him for his birthday. I'm sorry. Thank you. It was a long time ago, but, well, some losses never fully heal. They just become part of who you are. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Catherine, organizing her medical supplies, while Josiah helped move furniture and adjust the arrangement of equipment. The rooms were beginning to look like a real medical practice, professional, efficient, but somehow also welcoming. Catherine had a gift for creating spaces that felt both competent and comforting. As the sun began to set, painting the rooms in shades of gold and amber, Catherine stepped back to survey their progress. I think we can call this a successful day, she said. Tomorrow I'll put up my shingle and officially open for business. Are you nervous? Terrified, she admitted with a laugh, but also excited. This is what I've been working toward for years, The chance to practice medicine exactly the way I think it should be practiced, without having to argue with hospital administrators or compete with colleagues who think women have no business in the medical profession. She moved to the window and looked down at the street below, where evening lanterns were beginning to flicker on in houses and businesses. What about you, Josiah? Are you nervous about having a doctor practicing above your saloon? Should I be? Well, there will be people coming and going at all hours. Emergencies don't follow business schedules. And some of the procedures I'll be performing, well, let's just say they're not always quiet. Josiah considered this. Will you be able to save lives? Some of them, yes. Then I think I can handle a little inconvenience. Catherine turned from the window to look at him, and something in her expression made Josiah's breath catch. It wasn't an attraction, exactly, though he was increasingly aware of her as a woman, as well as a doctor and business partner. It was more like recognition, the look of someone who had found something they hadn't known they were looking for. Josiah, she said quietly, I want you to know that what you're doing here, helping me get established, offering protection, creating a safe space for people to gather, it matters. It matters more than you probably realize. Catherine, no, let me finish. I've been traveling for months, looking for the right place to set up practice. I've seen a lot of frontier towns, met a lot of frontier people. Most of them are good folks trying to build decent lives in hard circumstances. But what you're building here is different, special. She moved closer, and Josiah caught the faint scent of lavender soap and carbolic acid, a combination that was somehow uniquely Catherine. You're not just running a business. You're creating a place where people can be better versions of themselves. That's a rare gift. I'm just trying to make an honest living. You're doing much more than that, whether you realize it or not, and I'm honored to be part of it. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities that neither quite dared to name. Then Catherine stepped back, returning to her professional demeanor with visible effort. I should let you get back to your customers, she said. Thank you for all your help today. I couldn't have managed this without you. Any time, Josiah replied, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. As he headed downstairs to open the saloon for the evening crowd, Josiah found himself thinking about the way Catherine had looked at him when she talked about building something special. No one had ever looked at him that way before, like he was someone worth admiring rather than someone to be feared or avoided. The evening customers began arriving as the sun disappeared behind the western ridge, and Josiah served drinks and made conversation with the easy competence he'd developed over the past 6 months. But part of his attention remained focused on the sounds from upstairs, where Catherine was putting the finishing touches on her medical practice. Around 9 o'clock, she appeared at the top of the stairs that led down to the saloon. She'd changed from her practical work dress into something simpler but more elegant, and she'd let her hair down from its severe bun. The transformation was subtle but striking. She looked less like Dr. Catherine Whitmore, physician, and more like Catherine, woman. Gentlemen, she said to the room in general, I'm Dr. Catherine Whitmore, and starting tomorrow I'll be providing medical services from the rooms upstairs. If anyone has medical needs, injuries, illnesses, routine examinations, I hope you'll consider giving me the opportunity to help. The saloon had gone quiet during her introduction, 15 men turning to stare at this woman who had appeared among them like an exotic bird in a flock of crows. But it wasn't an unfriendly silence more, like the careful attention people paid to something unexpected, but potentially valuable. What kind of doctoring do you do, ma'am? Asked Pete Hansen, a rancher who'd lost 2 fingers to a poorly aimed axe the previous winter. Regular doctoring, or just the lady kind? Catherine smiled. I do all kinds of doctoring, Mr. Hansen. In fact, if you'd like me to take a look at that hand of yours, I might be able to do something about the pain you're still having. Pete looked startled. How'd you know it still hurts? The way you hold it, the way you favor it when you think no one's looking. Nerve damage from traumatic amputation often causes chronic pain, but there are treatments that can help. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the men. I'm also trained in surgery, obstetrics, and emergency medicine. I can set bones, treat gunshot wounds, deliver babies, and handle most other medical situations that might arise. What do you charge? Asked another voice from the back of the room. That depends on the service and the patient's ability to pay. I'm not here to get rich, gentlemen. I'm here to help people stay healthy and recover from injury or illness. Murmur of approval rippled through the room. These were practical men who appreciated practical answers, and Catherine had clearly given them exactly what they needed to hear. "Doc," said old Charlie Briggs, who'd been nursing the same whiskey for an hour, "my missus has been having trouble with her breathing lately. Gets short of breath just walking from the house to the chicken coop. Think that's something you could help with? I'd certainly like to examine her and see what might be causing the problem. Why don't you have her come see me tomorrow afternoon? No charge for the initial consultation." Charlie's face lit up with something that might have been hope. "That's mighty kind of you, Doc. Mighty kind." As the evening wound down and the customers gradually headed home to wives and beds and morning chores, Josiah found himself cleaning glasses and thinking about the way Catherine had handled herself with his patrons. She'd been professional but warm, confident but not arrogant, clearly competent but also clearly caring. She'd managed to introduce herself as both a medical authority and a member of the community, and she'd done it so smoothly that it seemed effortless. "That went well," Catherine said, appearing at his elbow as he dried the last glass. "Better than well. Charlie Briggs hasn't smiled like that since his horse won the summer races 2 years ago. His wife's symptoms sound like they could be heart-related. If I'm right, there are medications that could help significantly. And if you're wrong," Catherine's expression grew serious, "then I'll figure out what's actually wrong and try to help anyway. That's what doctors do, Josiah. We keep trying until we find an answer or run out of options." She picked up a bar towel and began helping him dry glasses, working with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. "I have a feeling this is going to work out well for both of us." "I hope so," Josiah said, then added quietly, "I really hope so." As they finished cleaning up and Catherine headed upstairs to her new home above the saloon, Josiah found himself thinking about leaps of faith and the courage it took to trust another person with your dreams. Catherine had trusted him with her medical practice, her safety, and her reputation. In return, he'd found himself offering not just space and protection, but something more precious, the hope that two people trying to build better lives might be able to build them together. It was a dangerous hope. But as Josiah locked up the silver dollar and headed to his own room, he decided it was a danger worth risking. Dr. Catherine Whitmore's first patient arrived before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge. Josiah was still brewing his morning coffee when urgent knocking rattled the saloon's front door. Through the window, he could see a young man clutching his arm against his chest, blood seeping between his fingers and staining his shirt a dark crimson. "Doc," the man called out. "Need a real doctor." Josiah unlocked the door and ushered the injured man inside just as Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs, already dressed and carrying her medical bag. She took one look at the patient and immediately shifted into the calm efficiency that Josiah was beginning to recognize as her professional mode. "What happened?" she asked, guiding the man toward the stairs. "Caught my arm in a hay baler," he gasped. "Metal teeth tore right through. Name's Billy Crenshaw, ma'am. Work for the Morrison spread." Josiah's hand instinctively moved toward his gun at the mention of the Morrison name, but Catherine was already focused entirely on her patient. "Can you make it upstairs, Billy, or do you need help?" "I can make it, Doc." As they disappeared up the stairs, Josiah found himself in an unfamiliar position, a spectator to someone else's crisis. For 15 years, he'd been the one people called when they needed problems solved, usually through violence. Now he was watching Catherine handle an emergency with tools he didn't understand and skills he couldn't provide, the sounds from upstairs. Told the story of Billy Crenshaw's treatment, Catherine's calm voice giving instructions, the clink of surgical instruments, the occasional grunt of pain from the patient. Josiah went about his morning routine sweeping, arranging bottles, checking inventory, but part of his attention remained focused on the medical drama playing out above his head. An hour later, Catherine emerged from her clinic with blood on her apron and satisfaction in her eyes. Billy Crenshaw followed her, his arm neatly bandaged and supported by a professional-looking sling. "Keep that arm elevated for the next 3 days," Catherine instructed. "Change the bandage daily, and if you see any signs of infection, redness, swelling, unusual heat, come back immediately." "Yes, ma'am. How much do I owe you?" $5 for the surgery and bandaging. "But I'll take 3 if that's what you can manage." Billy's relief was visible. "3 I can do, Doc. And I'll tell everyone at the Morrison place about what fine work you do." After Billy left, Catherine sat down heavily at one of the saloon tables, suddenly looking exhausted. "Well," she said, "that was an interesting way to start the day." Josiah poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her at the table. "How bad was it?" "Bad enough. The hay baler tore through muscle and damaged a tendon, but I was able to repair everything. He'll have full use of the arm if he follows my instructions and doesn't try to go back to work too soon." "Will he follow your instructions?" Catherine shrugged. "Some patients do, some don't. That's part of the challenge of frontier medicine. You can fix the immediate problem, but you can't control what happens after the patient leaves your care." She sipped her coffee gratefully. "This is good, thank you." "Catherine, Billy mentioned working for the Morrison spread. That's not the same Morrison as the man who threatened you the other day?" "No, that was Frank Morrison. Billy works for cattle ranchers named Morrison about 20 miles north of here. Common name in these parts, apparently." Josiah felt some tension leave his shoulders. "Good to know. Were you worried about me treating someone connected to your former associates?" "Maybe a little." Catherine reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "Josiah, when someone comes to me bleeding, I don't care who they work for or what their connections might be. I'm a doctor first, everything else second. Even if treating them might put you in danger, even then. That's what the Hippocratic oath means. First, do no harm. It doesn't say first, make sure you're safe, or first, check their credentials. Just do no harm." The simple certainty in her voice reminded Josiah why he'd been so struck by her confidence during their first meeting. Catherine Whitmore operated from a moral compass that pointed true north regardless of external circumstances, and she seemed incapable of compromise when it came to her principles. Over the following weeks, a comfortable routine developed between them. Catherine would see patients throughout the day while Josiah managed the saloon, and in the evenings they would share supper and conversation before Catherine returned to her medical journals and Josiah opened the bar for the night crowd. Their paths crossed dozens of times each day, Catherine coming downstairs for supplies, Josiah helping carry equipment, brief conversations about patients or business, but somehow these interactions never felt intrusive or overwhelming. People of Bitter Creek began to adapt to having a doctor in town with surprising speed. Charlie Briggs' wife did indeed have a heart condition, which Catherine treated with digitalis obtained through her medical supply connections. Pete Hansen's damaged hand improved dramatically after Catherine performed a minor surgery to repair some of the nerve damage. Word spread quickly through the territory that Bitter Creek had acquired a real doctor, and people began making the journey from neighboring settlements to seek Catherine's care. This influx of new faces was good for both the medical practice and the saloon business. People who came to town for medical appointments often stayed for meals and drinks, and many of them were impressed enough by both Catherine's competence and Josiah's hospitality to make return visits even when they weren't sick or injured. "We're becoming a destination," Catherine observed one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly busy day. "People are starting to plan trips to Bitter Creek rather than just passing through. Is that good or bad? Good, I think. The more people who know about us, the more legitimate we become. And legitimacy is protection of a sort." Josiah understood what she meant. A town that people visited, talked about, and remembered was harder to victimize than an isolated settlement that no one would miss. Catherine's medical practice was making Bitter Creek more visible, which made both of them safer in the long run. The changes went beyond mere business, though. Josiah found himself looking forward to their evening conversations with an intensity that surprised him. Catherine was unlike anyone he'd ever known, educated but not condescending, strong but not harsh, idealistic but not naive. She could discuss medical procedures with the same passion that other people reserve for religion or politics, and she had opinions about everything from literature to local politics that challenged Josiah to think about the world differently. "You know," Catherine said one evening as they sat on the saloon's front porch watching the stars emerge, "when I was studying medicine in Philadelphia, my professors used to talk about the frontier physician like it was some kind of romantic ideal, the noble doctor bringing civilization to the wilderness, armed with nothing but skill and determination. And now that you are one? Now I know that it's less romantic and more practical than anyone back east imagines. Yes, there's satisfaction in being the only medical help for miles around, but there's also pressure. When someone's life is in your hands and the nearest hospital is a week's ride away, the weight of responsibility can be overwhelming." She was quiet for a moment, and Josiah could see the fatigue that she usually kept hidden behind her professional competence. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm fooling myself, thinking I can make a real difference out here." "You saved Billy Crenshaw's arm," Josiah pointed out. "You're helping Charlie's wife breathe easier. Pete Hansen can use his hand properly for the first time in months. If that's not making a real difference, I don't know what is." Individual victories, yes, but what about the broader picture? The woman who died in childbirth last week because she was too far from medical help. The children who'll grow up with preventable conditions because their parents can't afford to bring them to town. The accidents and illnesses I'll never even hear about because people don't know I exist. Josiah considered this. In my previous work, I used to think about problems the same way. Focus on all the injustice I couldn't fix, all the bad men I couldn't stop, all the wrongs that would continue no matter what I did. Nearly drove me crazy. What changed? I realized that if you make the lives of the people right in front of you a little better, that's enough. You can't save everyone, but you can save someone. You can't fix everything, but you can fix something. And sometimes, the someone you save goes on to save someone else." Catherine turned to look at him. "Is that what you're doing with the saloon? Saving people one drink at a time?" Josiah laughed. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just trying to prove to myself that my hands can build something instead of destroying it." "And are you? Proving it, I mean. More every day." Their conversations had a way of revealing depths that neither had expected to share. Josiah found himself telling Catherine about his childhood in Kansas, about watching his parents work themselves to death, about the emptiness that had driven him to become a killer. Catherine shared stories about medical school, about the professors who'd tried to discourage her because of her gender, about the patients she'd lost and the ones she'd saved. These exchanges usually happened in the evenings, after the saloon had closed and Catherine had finished her paperwork for the day. They would sit on the porch or at one of the tables inside, drinking coffee or tea and talking about everything, except the growing attraction between them. Because there was an attraction, much as both tried to ignore it. It showed up in small ways. The extra care Josiah took with his appearance when he knew Catherine would be around. The way Catherine's professional demeanor softened when they were alone, the frequency with which their hands would brush when passing objects or working together, the comfortable silences that felt more intimate than conversation. Neither of them acknowledged this attraction directly, but it influenced their behavior in subtle ways. Josiah began reading more, partly to have interesting things to discuss with Catherine, and partly because her obvious intelligence made him aware of the gaps in his own education. Catherine started taking more care with her appearance, choosing dresses that flattered her figure and letting her hair down in the evenings instead of keeping it pinned up. The change was most obvious in how they worked together. What had started as polite cooperation had evolved into something approaching telepathy. Josiah could anticipate when Catherine needed supplies or assistance, often appearing with exactly what she required before she asked for it. Catherine began adjusting her schedule to accommodate the saloon's busiest times, seeing patients during Josiah's slow periods, and handling emergencies with minimal disruption to his business. This coordination became particularly important on the night that everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the air sharp with approaching winter, and the saloon filled with the usual crowd of ranchers, drifters, and townspeople seeking warmth and companionship. Josiah was behind the bar, listening to old Pete tell the same story about the great blizzard of '79 that he told every week. When the doors burst open and chaos entered, 3 men stumbled in, carrying a 4th between them, all of them covered in blood and panic. The injured man was unconscious, his shirt soaked crimson, his breathing shallow and labored. "Need a doctor," one of the carriers shouted. "Jimmy got shot." The saloon fell silent except for the sound of chairs scraping as patrons scrambled out of the way. Josiah was already moving toward the stairs before the man finished speaking. "Catherine," he called. "Emergency." She appeared at the top of the stairs within seconds, took one look at the situation, and immediately began issuing orders. "Bring him upstairs, quickly but carefully. Don't jostle him more than necessary. You," she pointed to one of the uninjured men, "run to my clinic and get the large bag marked surgery. You," she indicated another, "I need clean towels and hot water from the kitchen downstairs." The men obeyed without question, responding to the natural authority in Catherine's voice. Josiah found himself assigned to help carry the wounded man upstairs, trying to support the patient's weight while being careful not to worsen his injuries. Catherine's clinic was transformed into a surgical theater with remarkable speed. She lit additional lamps for better visibility, laid out instruments with practiced efficiency, and began examining the patient with hands that were steady despite the obvious severity of his condition. "Gunshot wound to the abdomen," she announced. "The bullet's still in there, and there's significant internal bleeding. This is going to be touch and go." "Doc," one of the men said nervously, "Jimmy's got a wife and 3 kids. You got to save him." "I'm going to try," Catherine replied without looking up from her examination. "But I need everyone except Mr. Thorne to wait downstairs. I can't work with a crowd in here." As the others reluctantly filed out, Catherine began preparing for surgery. With the calm focus Josiah had observed during her treatment of other patients, but intensified by the life-or-death nature of the situation. She scrubbed her hands thoroughly, laid out surgical instruments in precise order, and prepared anesthesia with careful measurements. "Josiah," she said, "I need you to assist me. Have you ever seen surgery before?" "No, but I've seen plenty of bullet wounds." "Good enough. I need you to hold this lamp steady and hand me instruments when I ask for them. Can you do that without fainting?" "I can do that." The surgery took 3 hours. 3 hours during which Josiah watched Catherine work. With a skill and determination that was almost superhuman, she located the bullet, extracted it without causing additional damage, repaired torn blood vessels, and sutured internal wounds with the precision of an artist and the speed of someone who understood that time was life. Throughout the procedure, She maintained a steady stream of calm narration, explaining what she was doing and why, as much for her own focus as for Josiah's education. Her hands never shook, her voice never wavered, and her concentration never flagged, even when the patient's breathing became so shallow that it seemed he might die on the operating table. "There," she said finally, beginning to close the external wound. "I've done everything I can. The next 24 hours will tell us whether it was enough." As Catherine cleaned and bandaged the wound, Josiah realized that he'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just skilled medical practice, but a demonstration of human courage and determination that humbled him. Catherine had literally held a man's life in her hands and refused to let it slip away. "Is he going to make it?" Josiah asked as they moved the unconscious patient to a recovery bed Catherine had set up in the smaller room. "I don't know. I repaired the damage as best I could, but there's always the risk of infection, complications, internal bleeding I might have missed. All we can do now is wait and hope." She looked exhausted, her dress stained with blood, her hair disheveled, from hours of intense concentration. But there was something in her eyes that Josiah had never seen before, not just professional satisfaction, but a kind of fierce joy. This was what Catherine Whitmore had been born to do, and she'd just done it as well as any doctor in any hospital back east. "Catherine," Josiah said quietly, "that was incredible." "That was medicine," she replied, but she was smiling. "Real medicine, the kind that makes all the study and training and sacrifice worthwhile." They went downstairs together to give the waiting men an update on their friend's condition. The saloon was still crowded, but the atmosphere had changed from its usual relaxed sociability to anxious concern. Word had spread that a man's life hung in the balance upstairs, and the entire community seemed to be holding its breath. "He's alive," Catherine announced to the room. "The surgery went well, but the next day or two will be critical. He needs rest, quiet, and constant monitoring." The relief in the room was palpable. Men who had been standing tensely around the bar relaxed their shoulders. Conversations resumed in subdued tones, and someone bought a round of drinks for everyone present. One of Jimmy's friends approached Catherine with tears in his eyes. "Doc, we can't thank you enough. Jimmy's a good man, got a family depending on him. You just ... you saved his life." "He's not out of danger yet," Catherine warned, "but I'm cautiously optimistic." As the evening wound down and the crowd gradually dispersed, Josiah and Catherine found themselves alone in the saloon, both too keyed up from the night's events to think about sleep. They sat at their usual table, drinking coffee and processing what had just happened. "How do you do it?" Josiah asked. "How do you stay so calm when someone's life is literally in your hands?" "Training helps, but mostly, you just accept that fear and uncertainty are part of the job. You can't let them paralyze you, because the patient needs you to act. What if you'd lost him?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Then I would have grieved, learned whatever lessons I could from the experience, and tried to do better next." "Time. You can't save everyone, Josiah. That's the hardest lesson any doctor learns. But you did save him. Tonight, you saved Jimmy's life. Tonight, yes. But there will be other nights, other patients, other outcomes. Some I'll save, some I won't. All I can do is give each one my best effort." She looked at him across the table, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight. "What about you? How did you feel watching surgery for the first time?" "Honored," Josiah said without hesitation. "Honored to be allowed to help, even in a small way. And proud to know someone who could do what you did tonight." Something shifted in Catherine's expression. A wall coming down or a door opening. "Josiah, I need you to know. Having you there, knowing you were steady and reliable and calm, it made the surgery easier. Better. I've operated alone before, but having a partner I could trust made all the difference." "Partner?" "In every way that matters, yes. We're partners, Josiah. In business, in purpose, and—" She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness, "and in whatever this is that's growing between us." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, like the moment before lightning strikes. For weeks they'd been dancing around their attraction, pretending it was purely professional interest, maintaining careful boundaries that were becoming harder to justify. "Catherine," Josiah said carefully, "I need you to understand what kind of partnership you'd be getting into. My past, your past is exactly that past. What matters is who you are now, who you're choosing to be. And the man you're choosing to be is someone I'd be proud to partner with in any endeavor." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know this is complicated. We work together, we live in the same building. We're both trying to build new lives in a place where privacy is scarce and gossip travels fast. But I also know that what we have is worth the complications." Josiah looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt. "What do we have exactly?" "Something rare," Catherine said. "Mutual respect, shared values, genuine affection, and the kind of trust that only develops between people who've seen each other at their worst and their best. Is that enough for a partnership that goes beyond business? I think it's exactly what the best partnerships are built on." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped across the table, while the implications of this new understanding settled around them. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the promise of winter and change. Inside, two people who had found each other despite themselves were finally admitting that they didn't want to navigate the future alone. "So what happens now?" Josiah asked. Catherine smiled, and it was the smile that had captured his attention from their very first meeting, confident, warm, and full of possibilities. "Now we figure out how to build something together that's bigger than either of us could build alone." It was, Josiah thought, the most beautiful proposition anyone had ever made to him. The trouble began with whispers and sideways glances 3 weeks after Jimmy Harrison recovered from his surgery. Catherine first noticed it during her morning rounds through town conversations that stopped when she approached. Shopkeepers who wouldn't quite meet her eyes, women who crossed the street rather than walk past her. The change was subtle, but unmistakable, like the pressure dropped before a storm. "Something's wrong," she told Josiah that evening as they sat in the saloon after closing time. "People are acting differently, nervous, like they're afraid of something." "Afraid of what?" "I don't know, but it's connected to me somehow. Mrs. Patterson actually pulled her children inside when she saw me coming down the street yesterday. She was asking about bringing her youngest in for a checkup." Josiah frowned, setting down the glass he'd been polishing. In the weeks since their partnership had evolved beyond business, he'd become increasingly attuned to Catherine's moods and concerns. "Any idea what might have changed?" "None. My medical practice has been going well. I haven't had any complications with recent patients, and I thought people were starting to accept having a female doctor in town." Before Josiah could respond, the saloon's front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. Frank Morrison strode in, flanked by 2 men Josiah didn't recognize, younger than Frank's usual associates, with the hungry look of men trying to build reputations through violence. Behind them came a 4th man who made Josiah's blood run cold, Reverend Tobias Kane, a fire and brimstone preacher who'd been run out of 3 towns for inciting violence against anyone he deemed morally corrupt. "Well, well," Frank said, his voice carrying the false joviality that Josiah remembered all too well. "Looks like Deadeye Thorne has been keeping interesting company." Reverend Kane stepped forward, his black coat and severe expression making him look like a carrion bird in human form. "Mr. Thorne, I am Reverend Tobias Kane. I've come to speak with you about the moral cancer that has taken root in your establishment." "Reverend," Josiah replied carefully, "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "The woman," Kane spat, his eyes burning with righteous fury. The so-called doctor who practices unnatural healing and consorts with unmarried men, this creature, has been corrupting the moral fiber of this community with her sinful ways. Catherine had gone very still beside Josiah, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Reverend Cain, I assume you're referring to me. I'm Dr. Catherine Whitmore, and I practice medicine, not whatever it is you're suggesting. Cain turned his burning gaze on her. Medicine? Is that what you call it when you touch men's bodies with your bare hands? When you see them unclothed and perform procedures that no decent woman should even know about? When you live, unmarried and unchaperoned, above a saloon with a known killer? I call it healing, Catherine replied, rising from her chair with the dignity of someone who refused to be intimidated. I call it using the skills I trained for years to acquire in order to help people who are sick or injured. You call it abomination, Cain thundered. You practice witchcraft and call it medicine. You seduce men with your unholy knowledge and corrupt them with your unnatural independence. Frank Morrison smiled, clearly enjoying the show. See, Josiah. This is what happens when you let a woman get ideas above her station. The good reverend here has been traveling through the territory, preaching about the dangers of female doctors and other such modern nonsense. Amazing how quickly people listen. When someone explains things properly, the pieces began falling into place for Josiah. Cain must have been spreading poison about Catherine throughout the territory, turning communities against female physicians by appealing to religious prejudice and fear of change. The whispers Catherine had noticed were the result of his influence. Reaching Bitter Creek. Reverend, Josiah said, his voice carrying a warning that Frank's companions clearly recognized. Even if Cain didn't, Dr. Whitmore is a respected member of this community. She's saved lives and helped people who had nowhere else to turn. She has corrupted them, Cain shrieked. She has made them dependent on the devil's healing instead of trusting in the Lord's will. She has convinced them that a woman can perform a man's work, that the natural order can be overturned without consequence. The only thing I've convinced them of, Catherine said quietly, is that broken bones can be set, that wounds can be cleaned and sutured, and that many illnesses can be treated with proper medical knowledge. If that's corruption, then I'm guilty as charged. Cain's face twisted with rage. You mock the Lord's will, woman. You interfere with his divine plan by keeping alive those he has chosen to call home. You practice unnatural arts and corrupt the minds of decent people with your foreign ideas. Foreign ideas like washing hands before surgery? Catherine asked, her scientific mind unable to resist challenging such obvious ignorance. Like using anesthesia to prevent unnecessary suffering? Like understanding that disease has natural causes rather than supernatural ones? It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Cain's eyes lit up with fanatic fervor. You see? She admits to practicing witchcraft. She speaks of causes beyond God's will. She claims knowledge that only the devil could provide. Frank stepped closer to the bar, his hand resting casually on his gun. Now, Josiah, I think you can see the problem we have here. The good reverend has been explaining to people throughout the territory how dangerous it is to let unnatural women practice their dark arts. Communities have been reconsidering their tolerance for such activities. What communities? Josiah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Silverton ran their lady doctor out last week, one of Frank's new men said with obvious satisfaction. Folks in Cedar Rapids decided they didn't need that kind of help neither. Amazing. How quick people come to their senses when someone explains the situation proper. Catherine's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. You've been systematically destroying female physicians' practices throughout the territory. We've been protecting communities from corruption, Cain corrected. From the unnatural influence of women who refuse to accept their proper place in God's plan. And making a profit while we're at it, Frank added with a grin. Turns out, Folks will pay good money to have troublemakers removed from their towns. Clean, efficient, and profitable. Josiah felt the familiar coldness settling into his chest, the emotional numbness that had kept him alive through 15 years of violence. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't fighting for money or reputation or even survival. He was fighting to protect something precious, something worth risking everything to defend. "Frank," he said quietly, "I think you and your friends should leave." "Can't do that, partner. You see, the good people of Bitter Creek have requested our services. They want the witch gone, and they're willing to pay to make it happen." "What people?" Catherine demanded. "Who exactly has asked you to do this?" Kane smiled, an expression that looked more like a snarl. "Righteous people, woman. People who understand that your presence here is an affront to everything decent and Christian." "Mrs. Patterson," Catherine said suddenly, understanding flooding her face. That's why she pulled her children inside. "You've been telling people that I'm dangerous, that treating a female doctor is somehow sinful." "I've been telling people the truth," Kane replied. "That women who practice such arts consort with dark forces, that communities which tolerate them invite divine punishment." "You've been telling people lies," Josiah corrected, his voice carrying the quiet menace that had once made strong men reconsider their life choices. "And now you're going to leave my establishment and my town, and you're not going to come back." Frank laughed. "Or what, Deadeye? You going to gun down a preacher and 2 of my boys? That'll look real good for your reputation as a reformed man." It was a clever trap. Frank knew that Josiah was trying to leave his violent past behind, knew that killing men in front of Catherine would destroy everything he'd built. Kane was equally clever hiding behind religious authority while promoting violence, knowing that attacking a preacher would turn public opinion against anyone who opposed him. "You're right," Josiah said, holstering his gun with deliberate care. "I'm not going to shoot anyone. I'm going to ask you politely to leave." Frank's grin widened. "And if we don't?" "Then I'm going to ask you less politely." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Frank's 2 companions had spread out slightly, positioning themselves for a gunfight. Kane stood behind them, practically vibrating with righteous excitement. Catherine remained beside Josiah, her chin raised in defiance despite the obvious danger. Then the saloon door opened again, and everything changed. Sheriff Henderson entered first, followed by Charlie Briggs, Pete Hansen, and a dozen other men from town. They formed a loose semicircle behind Frank's group, not openly threatening, but clearly present and accounted for. "Evening, folks," Henderson said casually. "Heard there might be some trouble brewing. Thought I'd stop by and make sure everyone's staying peaceful." Frank's confidence flickered. "Sheriff, this is a private matter. We're conducting business with Mr. Thorne." "Funny thing about business," Henderson replied. "When it involves threats against community members, it stops being private and starts being my concern." Charlie Briggs stepped forward, his weathered face creased with determination. "Doc Whitmore saved my wife's life. Anyone wanting to harm her has to go through me first. She fixed my hand when everyone said it was hopeless," Pete Hansen added. "Count me in." One by one, the other men voiced their support. These weren't gunfighters or professional tough guys. They were farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen. But they were also people whose lives had been touched by Catherine's skill and compassion, and they weren't going to stand by while strangers threatened her. Kane's face darkened with rage. "You fools! Can't you see that this woman has bewitched you? She's used her unnatural arts to cloud your judgment." "What she's done," said Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, "is deliver my grandson when the midwife couldn't handle the complications. What she's done is treat my broken ribs without charging more than I could afford. What she's done is show this community what real healing looks like." "She's a doctor," added Mary Sullivan, one of the few women brave enough to speak up. "A real doctor with real training, not some frontier quack with a bottle of whiskey and a rusty knife. My daughter was dying of fever until Dr. Whitmore treated her. If that's witchcraft, then I'm grateful for witches." Frank looked around the room, clearly calculating odds that had shifted dramatically against him. 3 guns against a dozen angry townspeople, and a sheriff wasn't the kind of mathematics that professional troublemakers preferred. "This isn't over," Frank said finally. "Word's going to spread about what kind of town Bitter Creek really is. People will know you're harboring an unnatural woman and the killer who protects her." "Let them know," Henderson replied calmly. "Let them know we're the kind of town that protects doctors who save lives, that stands up for people who make our community better, and that doesn't take kindly to outside agitators trying to tell us how to live." Kane stepped forward, his voice rising to the pitch he probably used for sermons. "You will regret this decision. Communities that harbor such corruption invite divine punishment. Plagues will come, crops will fail, children will die because you have turned away from righteousness." "The only thing that's failed here," Catherine said, speaking for the first time since the townspeople had arrived, "is your attempt to destroy someone's livelihood through ignorance and prejudice. I'm a doctor, Reverend Kane, not a witch. I heal people because that's what I trained to do, not because of any supernatural powers." She stepped forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I use techniques developed by the best medical minds in the world, techniques based on observation, experimentation, and scientific knowledge. If you want to call that witchcraft, then every hospital in Boston and Philadelphia is apparently a coven. Your very defiance proves your corruption." Kane shrieked. No godly woman would dare speak so boldly to a man of the cloth. And no man of genuine faith would try to prevent the healing of the sick and injured, Catherine shot back. "If God disapproves of medical knowledge, why did he give humans the intelligence to develop it?" The theological challenge clearly frustrated Kane, who was better at inspiring fear than defending complex arguments. Frank, meanwhile, was edging toward the door, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond salvage. "Come on, Reverend," Frank said. "We've delivered our message. Time to let these folks consider their choices." As they moved toward the exit, Kane turned back for one final pronouncement. "Mark my words, this town will suffer for its defiance. The Lord's justice will not be denied." "The Lord's justice," Henderson replied dryly, "includes protecting innocent people from harassment. Don't let me catch you in my territory again, Reverend." After Frank, Kane, and their associates had departed, the saloon erupted in nervous conversation. As people processed what had just happened, Catherine found herself surrounded by townspeople offering support, protection, and assurances that she was welcome in Bitter Creek, regardless of what outside agitators might say. "Doc," Charlie Briggs said, gripping her hand with both of his, "I want you to know that what that preacher said don't reflect how most of us feel. You've done nothing but good for this town." "We're grateful for your skills," added Pete Hansen. "And we're not about to let some traveling troublemaker drive you away." Similar sentiments came from around the room, and Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she realized how deeply her work had impacted these people's lives. She'd known intellectually that her medical practice was helping individuals, but seeing the community rally to her defense made the broader impact real in a way that statistics never could. "Thank you," she said to the room in general, "all of you. I wasn't sure how people really felt about having a female doctor in town. This means more than you know." "Means more to us," Tom Wheeler replied. "Good medical care is hard to find here. We're not about to give it up because some preacher thinks women should stay home and keep quiet." As the crowd gradually dispersed, Henderson approached Josiah and Catherine with a serious expression. "I need you both to understand something," he said quietly. "Kane and Morrison aren't going to give up easy. They've got a profitable operation going, turning communities against female doctors, and they don't like being defeated." "What do you think they'll do next?" Josiah asked. "Hard to say. They might try to stir up trouble in neighboring towns, spread stories about what happened here. Or they might try a more direct approach: sabotage, false accusations, maybe even violence. Catherine nodded grimly. In other words, this is just the beginning. Probably. But you've got something going for you that their other targets didn't: a community that's experienced your work firsthand and is willing to stand up for you. That's not easy to overcome. After Henderson left, Josiah and Catherine found themselves alone in the saloon, processing the evening's events. The confrontation had been a victory of sorts, but both understood that it was likely just the first battle in a longer war. "Josiah," Catherine said quietly, "I need you to know that if staying in Bitter Creek puts you in danger, I'll understand if you know," he interrupted firmly. "Don't even think it. We're partners, Catherine, in everything. If someone wants to hurt you, they have to go through me first. That's what I'm afraid of. Frank Morrison is dangerous, and now he has even more reason to want you dead. If something happened to you because of me... Josiah moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Catherine, listen to me. For 15 years, I used my skills to protect things that didn't matter: other people's money, other people's property, other people's pride. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I had something worth protecting. Someone worth protecting." He looked into her eyes, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Catherine squeezed his hands tightly. Together. Because some things are worth fighting for, and what you've built here, is one of them. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the promise of winter and the threat of harder times ahead. But inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, two people who had found something worth defending were making plans to keep it safe. Whatever the cost, the real test was just beginning. The attack came 3 nights later, not with guns blazing or dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet malice of poisoned words and strategic destruction. Catherine discovered it when she came downstairs for her morning coffee and found Josiah standing in the saloon's main room, staring at something on the bar, with an expression she'd never seen before: not anger, not fear, but a kind of hollow devastation that cut straight to her heart. "What is it?" she asked, moving to his side. Without speaking, he handed her a newspaper, not the local Bitter Creek Herald, but the territorial paper from Denver. The headline made her stomach clench: "Witch Doctor and Killer Terrorize Frontier Town. Religious Leader Exposes Unholy Alliance Between Female Charlatan and Notorious Gunfighter." The article was a masterpiece of inflammatory journalism, painting Catherine as a dangerous fraud who used unnatural feminine wiles to seduce communities into accepting her diabolic practices. It described Josiah as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered dozens of innocent men and was now using his reputation to protect his paramour's criminal activities. The piece quoted extensively from Reverend Kane's eyewitness account of their confrontation, portraying the townspeople's defense of Catherine as evidence that she had bewitched an entire community with her dark arts. "This is ... Catherine began, then stopped, unable to find words adequate for the mixture of rage and despair she felt. "Character assassination," Josiah finished grimly. "Professional-grade reputation destruction. Frank always was good at playing the long game." The worst part wasn't the lies about Catherine's medical practice or the exaggerated tales of Josiah's violent past. The worst part was how skillfully the article wove those lies together with just enough truth to make the entire fabrication believable. Yes, Catherine was an unmarried female doctor living above a saloon. Yes, Josiah had been a gunfighter with a deadly reputation. Yes, they had defended their partnership against religious opposition. But the article transformed these facts into a narrative of corruption, violence, and supernatural evil that would poison public opinion across the entire territory. "How many people will read this?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Thousands. The Denver paper goes to every major town in Colorado Territory, plus settlements in Wyoming, New Mexico, even parts of Kansas. By the end of the week, everyone from here to the Mexican border will know the names Deadeye Thorn and the Witch Doctor of Bitter Creek. Catherine sank into a chair, the weight of realization settling on her like a physical burden. My medical career is over. No community will accept a doctor with this kind of reputation attached to her name. Not just your career, Josiah said quietly. This affects both of us. The article makes it sound like we're running some kind of criminal enterprise together. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in contemplation of how thoroughly their lives had been appended by a single newspaper article. Outside, Bitter Creek was waking up to another ordinary day, unaware that two of its residents had just watched their futures collapse in newsprint. The first sign of how the article would affect their daily lives came when Mrs. Patterson appeared at the saloon's front door, clutching a copy of the Denver paper. Catherine recognized her immediately. She was one of the women who had been considering bringing her youngest child in for a medical examination. "Dr. Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson called through the glass, her voice tight with nervous energy. "I need to speak with you." Catherine opened the door, hoping against hope that Mrs. Patterson was coming to offer support or to dismiss the article as obvious nonsense. Instead, the woman stepped back several paces, as if being too close to Catherine might somehow contaminate her. "Is it true?" Mrs. Patterson demanded. "What the paper says about you practicing unnatural healing." "Mrs. Patterson, I practice medicine, scientific medicine based on techniques I learned at a legitimate medical college. There's nothing unnatural about setting bones or treating infections. But the paper says you use strange powers, that you consort with with evil forces." Catherine felt her heart sink as she realized that Mrs. Patterson wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking for confirmation of her fears. The article had taken root in the woman's mind like a poison, transforming a trusted community member into a source of supernatural dread. "Mrs. Patterson, you've lived in this town for months while I've been practicing medicine. Have you seen any evidence of supernatural activities? Any signs that I'm anything other than a doctor trying to help sick and injured people?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted nervously around the street, as if she expected demons to materialize at any moment. "Well, no, but the Reverend Kane says that devil worship can look like normal healing to those who haven't been properly instructed in recognizing the signs. And what signs are those?" "Success," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Too much success. The Reverend says that when someone heals people too well, too often, it's a sign they're getting help from other sources." The logic was perfectly circular and completely insane. Catherine's competence as a physician was being used as evidence of supernatural corruption. Her medical skills, instead of proving her training and dedication, were being reinterpreted as proof of diabolic intervention. "Mrs. Patterson," Catherine said gently, "do you really believe that God would disapprove of healing the sick? That using medical knowledge to help people is somehow evil? I don't know what to believe anymore. But I can't take chances with my children's souls. I'm sorry, Dr. Whitmore, but I won't be needing your services." After Mrs. Patterson hurried away, Catherine returned to the saloon to find Josiah reading a telegram that had arrived while she was outside. His expression was even grimmer than before. "Bad news?" she asked. "Sheriff Henderson. He's had inquiries from law enforcement in 3 different territories asking about our criminal activities. Apparently, the article has convinced some people that we're wanted fugitives or something similar." Catherine felt the world spinning slightly around her, but surely Henderson knows better. He was here during the confrontation. He saw what really happened. Henderson knows the truth, but he's one man. The article is reaching thousands of people who have no personal knowledge of who we are or what we've actually done. And Frank Morrison is probably following up with letters to law enforcement agencies. providing additional details about our supposed crimes. The systematic nature of the attack was becoming clear. This wasn't just a newspaper article, it was part of a coordinated campaign designed to destroy their reputation so thoroughly that they would be forced to flee bitter Creek or face legal persecution based on manufactured evidence. There's more, Josiah continued. Henderson says he's received a formal complaint from the Territorial Medical Board questioning your credentials and demanding an investigation into your unorthodox practices. My credentials are legitimate. I graduated from a recognized medical college, passed all required examinations, and maintained proper continuing education. I know that, and Henderson knows that, but investigations take time. During that time, you legally can't practice medicine without risking criminal charges. The trap was perfect. Even if Catherine could eventually prove her innocence and legitimacy, the investigation process would destroy her practice and force her to leave Bitter Creek. By the time she was cleared, Frank Morrison and Reverend Kane would have moved on to their next target, leaving behind only the wreckage of another female physician's career. How do we fight this? Catherine asked. I don't know, Josiah admitted. In my old line of work, problems were solved with bullets. But this is different. They're using law enforcement, public opinion, and official institutions against U.S. Shooting Frank Morrison wouldn't stop the investigation or change what people believe about us. They spent the rest of the morning discussing options, each more problematic than the last. Catherine could travel to Denver and attempt to defend herself before the medical board, but that would mean abandoning her practice and patients while the investigation proceeded. Josiah could try to track down Frank Morrison and force him to retract his statements, but that would only confirm the article's portrayal of him as a violent man who solved problems through intimidation. The afternoon brought more evidence of how thoroughly the article had poisoned public opinion. 3 patients canceled appointments. The weekly supply wagon arrived with only half their usual order, the driver explaining that his company was reconsidering their business relationships, and a group of traveling miners who had planned to stop in Bitter Creek for supplies decided to ride straight through to the next town instead. Most devastating of all was the visit from Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith who had spoken so passionately in Catherine's defense just days earlier. He appeared at the saloon's door near sunset, hat in hand and shame written across his weathered features. "Doc," he said, unable to meet her eyes, "I need to talk to you." "Of course, Tom. What can I do for you?" "It's what I can't do for you," he replied miserably. "My wife," she read that article. "She's convinced that if I keep supporting you, something terrible will happen to our family. She's talking about taking the children and leaving town if I don't distance myself from your practice." Catherine felt her heart break a little. Tom Wheeler was a good man caught between loyalty and fear, between what he knew to be true and what his wife had been convinced to believe. "I understand, Tom. You have to protect your family." "It ain't right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What that article says about you, it ain't true. I know it ain't true. But knowing something and being able to convince other people of it, those are different things. They are indeed. If there was anything I could do, any way to help without putting my family at risk, there isn't," Catherine said gently. "And I wouldn't ask you to choose between helping me and protecting them. Take care of your wife and children, Tom. That's what matters." After Tom left, Catherine and Josiah found themselves alone in the saloon, surrounded by the evidence of how quickly a life could be destroyed by well-crafted lies and systematic character assassination. The silence between them stretched for several minutes before Josiah finally spoke. "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago." She looked up from the medical journal she'd been pretending to read. "What is it?" "The first time Frank Morrison came here, when he tried to recruit me for that job in New Mexico, I was tempted. Not by the money, but by how simple it would have been. Kill a few farmers, collect $5,000, right away from all the complications of trying to build a decent life. Catherine set down her journal, giving him her full attention. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because you walked through that door and showed me that there were alternatives to violence. That problems could be solved through intelligence and courage instead of bullets. He moved to sit across from her at the table where they'd shared so many evening conversations. But now I'm wondering if I was wrong. If maybe the only language men like Frank Morrison understand is the one I spoke for 15 years. You're talking about challenging him to a gunfight. I'm talking about ending this the way I know how to end things, permanent-like. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his words, but the pain behind them. She could see how much the systematic destruction of their lives was costing him, how helpless he felt in the face of an enemy he couldn't shoot. Josiah, she said finally, if you kill Frank Morrison, what happens next? Next? Do you think Reverend Kane will simply pack up and leave? Do you think the Territorial Medical Board will drop their investigation? Do you think the people who read that article will suddenly decide that maybe a gunfighter's word is more trustworthy than a preacher's? Josiah's shoulders sagged as he realized the futility of what he'd been contemplating. It would just confirm everything they've written about us. Worse than that, it would prove that Deadeye Thorne was never really reformed, that he was just waiting for an excuse to kill again. And it would prove that I'm the kind of woman who corrupts good men and drives them back to violence. She reached across the table and took his hands in hers. The man you were would have solved this problem with a gun. The man you are now knows that some problems can't be solved that way. Then how do we solve it? Maybe we don't. Maybe some problems can only be survived. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, a woman Catherine had never seen before, dressed in traveling clothes and carrying a worn leather medical bag. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of steady gaze that Catherine recognized from her own mirror. Dr. Whitmore, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Harrison. I've traveled from Santa Fe to meet you. Catherine shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calloused fingers of someone accustomed to manual work. Dr. Harrison, what brings you to Bitter Creek? A newspaper article, actually. The one that's been circulating throughout the territory. I read it and decided I needed to see for myself this witch doctor who was supposedly terrorizing frontier communities. Elizabeth Harrison's smile was wry and knowing. You see, Dr. Whitmore, I've been practicing medicine on the frontier for 12 years. I've been called a witch, a charlatan, an unnatural woman, and worse. I've been run out of towns, threatened by religious fanatics, and accused of everything from devil worship to prostitution. When I read that article, I recognize the pattern. Pattern? There's a systematic campaign being conducted against female physicians throughout the Western territories. What happened to you has happened to at least 6 other women doctors in the past year. Always the same progression: arrival of a traveling preacher, allegations of supernatural activities, inflammatory newspaper coverage, investigation by territorial authorities. Catherine felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that she wasn't alone, that other women had faced similar attacks. Horror at the scope of what she was hearing. 6 others? That I know of personally. Dr. Margaret Foster in Silverton, Dr. Ruth Baldwin in Cedar Rapids, Dr. Sarah Mitchell in Pine Grove. The list goes on. All of us competent physicians with legitimate credentials. All of us driven from our practices by the same coordinated effort. Dr. Harrison sat down at one of the saloon tables as if she belonged there. The men behind this campaign are smart. Dr. Whitmore. They understand that frontier communities are simultaneously desperate for medical care and suspicious of change. They exploit that contradiction by convincing people that female doctors represent a supernatural threat to community stability. But why? What do they gain from destroying women's medical practices? Control, profit, the satisfaction of keeping women in what they consider our proper place. Reverend Kane genuinely believes that women practicing medicine is a sign of social decay. Frank Morrison sees it as a profitable business opportunity. Together, they've developed a system for destroying careers and reputations with surgical precision. Elizabeth reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. I've been documenting their activities, gathering evidence of the pattern. Testimony from women they've targeted, copies of similar newspaper articles, records of complaints filed with territorial authorities. I'm building a case. What kind of case? Legal action against Kane and Morrison for conspiracy, fraud, and criminal harassment. It's a long shot. The territorial courts aren't particularly sympathetic to women's concerns, but it's the only way to stop them. Catherine felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. What can I do to help? Continue practicing medicine. Refuse to be driven away. Document everything, every threat, every false accusation, every attempt to interfere with your legitimate medical practice. We need evidence that their campaign isn't just targeting individual women, but is designed to eliminate female physicians. Entirely. Elizabeth stood up, shouldering her medical bag with practiced ease. I have 3 more doctors to visit before I return to Santa Fe. Women who are facing the same attacks you're experiencing. Together, we might be able to build a case strong enough to put an end to this campaign. Dr. Harrison, Catherine said as the other woman prepared to leave. Thank you. I was beginning to think I was fighting this alone. You're not alone, Doctor Whitmore. There are more of us than they realize, and we're stronger when we work together. After Elizabeth Harrison left, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since the newspaper article appeared. Hope. Not just for her own situation, but for the broader struggle of women trying to practice medicine in a world determined to stop them. That evening, as she and Josiah shared supper and discussed the day's revelations, Catherine made a decision that surprised them both. I'm not leaving, she announced. Catherine, I'm not leaving Bitter Creek, I'm not abandoning my practice, and I'm not giving Frank Morrison and Reverend Kane the satisfaction of driving me away. Josiah studied her face in the lamplight, seeing a determination that was different from her usual professional confidence. This was deeper, more personal, even if it means facing criminal charges, even if the Territorial Medical Board suspends your license, even then. Because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about every woman who wants to practice medicine, every community that needs medical care, and every person who believes that competence matters more than gender. She reached across the table and took his hand. Besides, I have something that the other woman Dr. Harrison mentioned didn't have. What's that? A partner who's willing to stand with me, whatever the cost. Josiah squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses from surgical instruments and the strength from years of refusing to give up. Always. Outside, the autumn wind was turning. Colder, carrying the promise of a hard winter ahead. But inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, 2 people who had found each other against all odds were making plans to weather whatever storms might come. They had learned that some battles couldn't be won with guns or threats or individual heroism. But they had also learned that some things were worth fighting for anyway, even when victory seemed impossible. Especially then. The vindication came on a crisp February morning 6 months later, delivered in the form of 3 official documents that arrived on the same stagecoach. The first was a telegram from Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, federal charges filed. Morrison and Kane arrested Denver, campaign exposed. Your testimony is crucial. Congratulations. The second was a letter from the Territorial Medical Board, formally clearing Catherine of all allegations and offering an official commendation for her exemplary service to frontier communities under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. Third was an unexpected surprise, a job offer from the Colorado Territorial Hospital in Denver, requesting Catherine's services as chief of surgery with a salary that would have made her wealthy by any frontier standards. Catherine read each document twice, then set them carefully on the bar where Josiah was preparing for the morning opening. "It's over," she said simply. Josiah examined the papers, his expression shifting from relief to pride to something that looked almost like sadness. "This is everything you wanted. Complete vindication, professional recognition, and an opportunity to practice medicine at the highest level." "Yes, it is." "When do you leave for Denver?" Catherine looked at him sharply. "Who said anything about leaving?" "Catherine, this is the chance of a lifetime. Chief of surgery at the Territorial Hospital? You'd be one of the most important physicians in the entire region. I'd also be working in a hospital with 20 other doctors, treating patients who have multiple medical options, living in a city where my gender is seen as a professional curiosity rather than a community asset." She moved closer to him, studying his face with the careful attention she usually reserved for diagnosing patients. "Is that what you want? For me to take the position in Denver?" "I want what's best for you. That's not what I asked." Josiah was quiet for a long moment, polishing a glass that was already clean while he considered his answer. "No," he said finally. "I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay here, to keep practicing medicine in that clinic upstairs, to keep having conversations with me over supper about your patients and your procedures and your plans for improving healthcare in rural communities, and I want to wake up every morning knowing that you're here, that we're building something together that matters more than either of us could build alone." Catherine smiled, the same smile that had captured his attention during their first meeting, but deeper now, warmed by months of shared purpose and growing love. "Then you'll be happy to know that I've already written my response to the Denver offer." She pulled a sealed envelope from her apron pocket. A polite declination, along with a recommendation that they consider Dr. Sarah Mitchell for the position. She was one of the women Dr. Harrison mentioned driven out of Pine Grove by Kane's campaign. "She deserves the opportunity more than I do." Josiah felt relief wash over him like cool water on a hot day. "You're staying." "I'm staying. But not just because of the medical practice, and not just because I've grown attached to this community." "Then why?" "Because 6 months ago, a famous gunfighter told me that some things were worth fighting for. And because over the past year, I've discovered that he was right." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. "I'm staying because I found something here that I never found in Chicago or Philadelphia or anywhere else I've practiced medicine." "What's that?" "A partner who sees my work as something worth protecting. A man who values healing as much as he once valued other skills. Someone who understands that the best kind of strength isn't the ability to destroy, but the courage to build something better." Josiah set down the glass he'd been polishing and faced her fully. "Catherine, there's something I need to ask you. Something I've been thinking about since we decided to fight this thing together." "What is it?" "Marry me." The proposal was as direct and honest as everything else between them had been. No elaborate romantic gestures, no flowery speeches about love conquering all. Just a simple request from one partner to another to make their collaboration official in every way that mattered. "Yes," Catherine replied without hesitation. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes, I want to make this partnership legal and permanent, and everything else that marriage means." She laughed at the surprise on his face. "Did you really think I'd say no? After everything we've been through together, I thought you might want time to consider. Marriage is a big decision, especially for a woman with your education and opportunities." "Josiah, I've had months to consider. Every evening conversation, every crisis we've weathered together, Every moment when you chose to support my work instead of seeing it as competition, it's all been leading to this." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that years of hard living had carved around his eyes. "Besides, I've already seen what kind of husband you'll be. Supportive, protective, respectful of my work and my independence. What more could any woman ask for? A man without a reputation for killing? A man who chose to stop killing. That takes more courage than most people ever have to show." They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that perfectly reflected who they had become together. Sheriff Henderson performed the service in the Silver Dollar Saloon, surrounded by the same townspeople who had defended Catherine against Reverend Kane's accusations. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison traveled from Santa Fe to serve as Catherine's witness, while Charlie Briggs stood up for Josiah Dott instead of a traditional wedding dress. Catherine wore the deep blue dress she'd been wearing the day they first met, claiming it had already brought her more luck than any amount of white silk could provide. Josiah wore his best suit, still black, but without the gun belt that had once defined him. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, focused on the vows they wrote themselves rather than traditional religious language. Catherine promised to support Josiah's efforts to build rather than destroy, to see his strength as protection rather than threat, and to never let the past define their future. Josiah promised to protect Catherine's right to practice medicine, to support her professional independence, and to prove every day that a man could change completely when he found something worth changing for. "Do you have rings?" Henderson asked. Josiah reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 simple gold bands. "Made them myself," he said, a touch of pride in his voice. "Tom Wheeler taught me some basic metalworking." The rings were beautiful, in their simplicity, unadorned circles of gold that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with their own inner warmth. As they exchanged rings, Catherine marveled at the hands that placed the band on her finger. Hands that had once been instruments of death were now skilled in the delicate art of jewelry making. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Henderson announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that followed was gentle but certain, a seal on promises that had been building between them for months. When they broke apart, the saloon erupted in cheers and applause from people who had watched their relationship develop and had invested themselves in its success. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music provided by a traveling fiddle player and dancing that transformed the Silver Dollar into something it had never been before, a place of pure joy. Catherine danced with every man present, from Charlie Briggs to Sheriff Henderson to Tom Wheeler, who had overcome his wife's objections long enough to attend the wedding. But it was her final dance with Josiah that everyone would remember. As the fiddle player struck up a slow waltz, the crowd cleared a space in the center of the saloon floor. Josiah, who had never learned to dance properly, moved with Catherine in a simple pattern that was more walking than dancing, but somehow perfect for who they were. "Any regrets?" he asked as they swayed together in the lamplight. "Only one," Catherine replied. "What's that?" "That it took us so long to get here." As the music played and the community celebrated around them, Catherine found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a traveling doctor looking for a place to practice medicine. Josiah had been a retired gunfighter trying to forget his past. Neither had been looking for love, partnership, or the kind of deep connection that transformed two people into something greater than the sum of their parts. But somehow, through crisis and challenge, through external threats and internal doubts, they had found exactly what they hadn't known they needed. They had found each other. The months that followed their wedding established a rhythm that felt both new and eternal. Catherine's medical practice flourished as word spread throughout the territory that the witch doctor of Bitter Creek had been completely vindicated and was, in fact, one of the most skilled physicians on the frontier. Patients traveled from hundreds of miles away to seek her care, turning Bitter Creek into a regional medical center. Josiah expanded the Silver Dollar, adding rooms for long-term patients and their families, creating a kind of informal hospital that complemented Catherine's clinic perfectly. He also began training with Catherine, learning basic medical techniques that allowed him to assist during emergencies and provide care when she was unavailable. The transformation was remarkable to observe. The man who had once been known as Deadeye Thorne, the fastest gun west of Denver, was now learning to set bones, stitch wounds, and comfort patients with the same methodical dedication he had once applied to killing. His large hands, which had been instruments of death for 15 years, proved surprisingly gentle when applied to healing. "You have good instincts for this work," Catherine told him one evening as they finished treating a rancher who had been thrown from his horse. "Have you ever considered formal medical training? At my age? Starting from scratch? Why not? You're only 35, and you already understand more about anatomy than most first-year medical students. Not to mention that your reputation would open doors that are closed to most people." Josiah considered this. "You think people would trust medical care from a former gunfighter?" "I think people trust competence, regardless of where it comes from. And I think there's something powerful about a man who chose healing over violence." The idea took root gradually, growing through late-night conversations and quiet moments of shared work. By spring, Josiah had enrolled in a correspondence course through the University of Denver, beginning the long process of acquiring formal medical education to complement the practical training Catherine provided. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. The man who had once carried a gun to solve problems was now carrying medical textbooks. The hands that had dealt death were learning to preserve life. It was a transformation that seemed almost mythical in its completeness. Their personal relationship continued to deepen as well. Marriage had given them the freedom to acknowledge feelings that had been building for months, and they discovered that their intellectual and professional compatibility extended to every other aspect of their lives. They shared a sense of humor, a dedication to their work, and a vision of what their life together could become. Most importantly, they shared an understanding that their partnership was about more than just personal happiness. They were building something that served the broader community, creating a model for how two people with different skills and backgrounds could work together to solve problems and help others. The true measure of how completely their lives had changed came on a hot July afternoon when a young man rode into Bitter Creek looking for Deadeye Thorne. Catherine recognized the type immediately, barely out of his teens, wearing his gun low and tied down, with the hungry look of someone seeking a reputation through violence. "You Thorne?" the young man called out as Josiah emerged from the saloon. Name's Billy Craddock. I come here to call you out." Josiah studied the young man with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for analyzing opponents in gunfights. What he saw was a scared kid trying to prove his manhood through violence, probably driven by stories he'd heard about the legendary Deadeye Thorne. "What's your grievance with me, son?" "Don't need a grievance. Just need to know if you're as fast as folks say." A year ago, Josiah might have felt compelled to respond to such a challenge. His reputation had been built on never backing down from a fight, never showing fear or weakness. But the man who stood in the street that day was not the same man who had built that reputation. "I'm not interested in fighting you, Billy. You scared?" "No, son, I'm married." The answer clearly wasn't what Billy Craddock had expected. He looked confused, as if the concept of marriage as a deterrent to gunfighting had never occurred to him. "What's that got to do with anything?" Catherine appeared in the saloon doorway, medical bag in hand, having heard the confrontation from her clinic. She took in the scene immediately. Young gunfighter, formal challenge, her husband choosing words over weapons. "It means," Catherine said, stepping into the street, "that he has more important things to do than prove himself to every young man who's looking for an easy reputation." Billy's eyes widened as he realized who Catherine must be. You're the doc, the one they wrote about in the papers. I'm Dr. Catherine Thorne, yes. And you're a young man who's about to make a very foolish decision. Ain't nothing foolish about calling out a famous gunfighter. There is when the gunfighter has better things to do with his time. Catherine moved closer to Billy, studying him with professional interest. When did you last eat a proper meal? What's that got to do with anything? You're showing signs of malnutrition, pale complexion, tremor in your hands, difficulty focusing. You're also favoring your left leg, which suggests an injury you haven't had properly treated. Billy looked down at himself as if seeing his physical condition for the first time. So you're challenging my husband to a gunfight when you're in no condition to defend yourself. That's not courage, it's stupidity. She gestured toward the saloon. Come inside. Let me examine that leg and get some food in you. Then, if you still want to make this challenge, at least you'll be doing it at full strength. Billy looked confused, glancing between Catherine and Josiah as if he'd stumbled into a situation that no one had prepared him for. You're offering to help me before I fight your husband? I'm offering to provide medical care to someone who needs it. What happens after that is your choice. The young man holstered his gun with obvious uncertainty. This ain't how these things usually go. No, Josiah agreed, it isn't. But maybe that's because there's a better way to handle things. An hour later, Billy Craddock sat at one of the saloon tables, his leg properly bandaged and a plate of Catherine's beef stew in front of him. The meal had transformed him from a dangerous young gunfighter into what he actually was, a scared, hungry kid a long way from home. Where are you from, Billy? Catherine asked as she finished wrapping his injured leg. Kansas, originally. Been drifting since my po died last winter. And you thought that challenging gunfighters to duels was a good way to make a living? Billy shrugged, suddenly looking even younger than his 19 years. Heard there was good money in having a reputation. Figured if I could outdraw Deadeye Thorne, folks would hire me for ... things. What kind of things? Josiah asked, though. He already knew the answer. Protection work. Settling disputes, whatever pays well. Josiah sat down across from Billy, seeing himself as he had been 20 years earlier, young, alone, and convinced that violence was the answer to life's problems. Billy, can I tell you something about that life? I guess. It's not what you think it is. Yes, there's money in being a gunfighter, but there's a cost that nobody tells you about. You stop sleeping well because you're always watching for the next challenge. You stop trusting people because everyone's either afraid of you or trying to use you. You stop seeing yourself as anything other than a weapon. Billy listened with the intense attention of someone hearing the truth for the first time. But you made it work. You got famous, made money, survived long enough to retire. I survived, yes, but I didn't live, not really. For 15 years, I was Deadeye Thorne, the fastest gun west of Denver. But I wasn't Josiah Thorne, human being. I wasn't anyone worth knowing or loving or remembering for anything good. Josiah glanced at Catherine, who was listening with the same interest as Billy. It wasn't until I stopped being a gunfighter that I started being a man. It wasn't until I found something worth building that I understood what I'd been missing. What was that? Purpose. Real purpose, not just the temporary satisfaction of being feared. The chance to create something instead of destroying it. The opportunity to be part of something bigger than myself. Billy looked around the saloon, taking in the clean tables, the medical equipment visible through the open door to Catherine's clinic, the obvious signs of a thriving business and a happy life. And you built all this? We built it, Catherine corrected. Together. That's the real secret, Billy. Nothing worth having can be built alone. Billy finished his stew and sat back in his chair, clearly thinking hard about everything he'd heard. So what am I supposed to do? I can't go back to Kansas, nothing there for me. I don't have any skills except shooting. And you're telling me that's not a life worth living. I'm telling you that it's not the only life available to you, Josiah said. There are other ways to make a living, other ways to build a reputation. Such as? Catherine and Josiah exchanged a look, and Catherine nodded slightly. Such as helping us, Josiah said. We've been talking about expanding our operation, maybe opening a proper hospital. We could use someone with good reflexes and steady hands to help with medical emergencies. You'd teach me? Medical work? If you're willing to learn. It's not easy work, and it doesn't pay as well as gunfighting. But it's honest work that helps people instead of hurting them. Billy was quiet for a long moment, staring at his empty plate as he considered the offer. What about my reputation? What will people say if Billy Craddock becomes a nurse or something? They'll say that Billy Craddock was smart enough to choose a life over a death, Catherine replied. And eventually, they'll forget about Billy Craddock, the would-be gunfighter, and remember Billy Craddock, the man who helped save lives. 6 months later, Billy Craddock was one of the most valued assistants in the Bitter Creek Medical Center, the expanded facility that Catherine and Josiah had built to serve the growing number of patients seeking their care. Billy had proven to have natural aptitude for medical work, and his young hands were steadier than many trained physicians when it came to delicate procedures. More importantly, Billy had become living proof that people could change completely when given the opportunity and support to do so. His transformation from would-be gunfighter to medical assistant inspired other young men to consider alternatives to violence, creating a ripple effect that spread throughout the territory. As Catherine often said during her speeches at medical conferences, for she had become a sought-after speaker on frontier medicine, the most powerful healing often had nothing to do with surgery or medication. Sometimes it was simply showing someone that there was a different way to live. On a crisp October evening, 1 year after their wedding, Catherine and Josiah sat on the porch of their expanded home behind the medical center, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Bitter Creek. The town had grown considerably in the past year, drawn by the reputation of their medical facility and the promise of the kind of community that valued healing over violence. Any regrets? Catherine asked, echoing the question Josiah had posed on their wedding night. Just one, Josiah replied. What's that? That it took me 34 years to figure out what life was supposed to be about. Catherine smiled, taking his hand in hers. The calluses from years of gunfighting had been joined by new calluses from medical work, creating a map of transformation written in the language of hard-earned skill. I carry a 6-shooter, Josiah continued, but your smile is my only weapon now. It was a line he'd spoken to her privately many times, but somehow it felt different this evening, less like a romantic declaration and more like a statement of fundamental truth about who they had become together. Our weapon, Catherine corrected. Everything we've built here, everything we've accomplished, it's been a partnership from the beginning. She was right, as she usually was. The medical center, the transformed community, the young people like Billy Craddock who were choosing healing over violence, none of it would have been possible without both of their contributions, both of their skills, both of their commitment to building something better. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine and Josiah made plans for the future. There was talk of establishing a medical school in Bitter Creek, training a new generation of frontier physicians. There were discussions about expanding their hospital services, maybe even attracting specialists from back east. There were dreams of continuing to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. But mostly, there was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had found what most people spent their entire lives searching for: a purpose worth pursuing, work worth doing, and someone worth sharing it all with. The gunfighter had become a healer. The traveling doctor had found a home. And together, they had proven that love wasn't just about finding someone you couldn't live without. It was about finding someone who made you want to become the best version of yourself. In the end, That had been their greatest achievement. Not the medical center, or the transformed community, or the lives they had saved. Their greatest achievement was the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to create a future that was better than the past they had left behind. It was, Catherine thought as she watched the first stars appear, exactly what the world needed more of. People brave enough to change, wise enough to grow, and loving enough to do it together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.